The beach had no name on most American maps. It was simply a stretch of coral sand on the southwestern coast of Bougainville Island, hemmed in by jungle so thick, and with that daylight barely reached the ground beneath the canopy. The date was November 1st, 1943, and the men of the 3rd Marine Division were coming ashore at Cape Torquena in the largest American amphibious operation the Pacific had yet seen. Landing craft bucked through a heavy surf, and more than 14,000 Marines were pressing toward a coastline that the Imperial Japanese Army had sworn, in the blunt language of its field orders, would be held to the last man. For most of those Marines, the morning was already a blur of salt water, engine noise, and the distant crack of rifle fire rolling in off the tree line. But for one man crouching in the bow of a Higgins boat, the morning had taken on a particular, almost personal quality of misery. Private First Class Henry Girk, a 21-year-old from Netch, North Dakota, was seasick. He had been seasick since before dawn. The landing craft rose and plunged, and the diesel fumes wrapped around him, and his stomach had long since emptied itself into the Pacific Ocean. He was pale, he was shaking, and by every outward measure, he was the least threatening figure in the entire assault force. Within 4 hours, he would be dead, and the ground he chose to defend, alone, against odds that no rational military calculation would have endorsed, would be held. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Henry Girk did on that beach, and why it mattered in a way that extended far beyond a single desperate morning, you have to understand what Bougainville meant to both sides in the autumn of 1943, and what the men of the 3rd Marine Division had been told to expect when they went ashore. By the fall of 1943, the war in the Pacific had settled into a grinding island-by-island logic that consumed men and material at a rate that astonished even the commanders who were ordering it. The Allied strategy, articulated by Admiral William Halsey and General Douglas MacArthur in their separate but converging campaigns, was to neutralize the massive Japanese base at Rabaul on the northeastern tip of New Britain. Rabaul was no ordinary garrison. It held approximately 100,000 Japanese troops. It was defended by hundreds of aircraft and served by one of the finest natural harbors in the Southwest Pacific. Destroying Rabaul outright was judged to be prohibitively costly. The plan, therefore, was to isolate it, to cut its supply lines, neutralize its airfields, and leave it to wither while Allied forces pushed westward and northward toward the Philippines and ultimately Japan itself. Bougainville was the key to that strategy. The largest island in the Solomon chain, Bougainville lay roughly 250 miles southeast of Rabaul. If the Americans could establish airfields on Bougainville, their fighters and bombers would be within striking range of Rabaul's harbor and its network of airstrips. The Japanese understood this arithmetic exactly as well as the Americans did. They had stationed approximately 40,000 troops on Bougainville under Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, the same officer whose 17th Army had suffered so catastrophically on Guadalcanal. Hyakutake was not going to repeat that experience. His forces were dug in across the island, concentrated primarily at the southern Port Ben and the northern anchorage at Buka Passage, with intermediate garrisons strung along the coastline and through the interior. The Americans, for their part, were not trying to conquer the entire island. That was a crucial distinction, and one that shaped every decision made in the planning of Operation Cherry Blossom, as the Bougainville landings were officially designated. The objective was a lodgment, a beachhead large enough to build airfields, with a perimeter defensible enough to protect those airfields while construction crews worked. Cape Torquena, on Empress Augusta Bay on the western coast of Bougainville, was selected because it was lightly defended by Japanese standards, reasonably flat for construction purposes, and far enough from the main Japanese concentrations at Ben and Buka that a rapid counterattack in overwhelming force was considered unlikely, at least in the first critical hours. Lightly defended by the standards of Bougainville in 1943 meant roughly 300 Japanese soldiers of the 23rd Infantry Regiment in the immediate vicinity of the landing beaches. They were deployed in a network of bunkers, spider holes, and covered firing positions that the preliminary naval bombardment, delivered by cruisers and destroyers of Halsey's South Pacific Force in the pre-dawn darkness of November 1st, had suppressed but not destroyed. The naval planners knew this. The marine planners knew this. The men in the landing craft knew this. or suspected it, which amounted to the same thing in practical terms. What the planners had also factored in, though the men in the boats could not fully appreciate it from their particular vantage point of seasickness and diesel fumes, was the surf. Cape Torquena had a surf condition that the pre-landing reconnaissance had characterized as rough. This was an understatement of considerable proportion. The swells running into the beach on the morning of November 1st were between 5 and 8 feet, generated by a weather system moving through the Solomon Sea. Landing craft broached in the surf, spilling men and equipment into the water. At least 60 for the approximately 140 landing craft that went into the beach on the first wave were damaged or destroyed by the surf and by Japanese fire. Men waded ashore in chest-deep water, holding their rifles above their heads, emerging onto a beach that was already under fire from Japanese positions in the tree line and from a network of bunkers that anchored the defensive line. Henry Girk's unit was the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion. The Raiders were an elite formation by any standard, selected for physical toughness, trained in unconventional tactics, and accustomed to operating in exactly the kind of close, jungle terrain that surrounded Cape Torquena. The concept of the Marine Raiders had been championed by President Franklin Roosevelt himself, who was intrigued by the British commando model, and the battalion had been formally organized in September of 1942. By November 1943, the 3rd Raiders had already seen combat at New Georgia and in the smaller actions along the Solomon's chain. They were not green troops. They were not easily frightened, and they had been briefed on what they were going to find on the beach at Cape Torquena. What they were not fully briefed on, what no pre-landing intelligence had adequately conveyed, was a specific disposition of a Japanese strong point on the right flank of the landing area, where a reinforced bunker system commanded a stretch of beach that the Raiders were assigned to clear. The bunker complex had been built into the root system of a large banyan tree at the edge of the jungle, giving it overhead cover against anything short of a direct artillery hit. From its firing apertures, a pair of Japanese light machine guns could sweep the beach laterally for a distance of roughly 200 yards in either direction. The crew manning those guns, estimated at somewhere between 15 and 20 men in the initial assessments, though the actual number was considerably larger, had survived the naval bombardment by the simple expedient of having dug deep enough and reinforced their overhead protection thoroughly enough that naval gunfire could not reach them directly. When Henry Girk's landing craft hit the beach, the bunker was already in action. The first minutes of a contested amphibious landing produce a specific kind of chaos that is unlike almost any other combat experience. There is no continuous front line. There is no clear sense of where the enemy is or how many of them there are. There are men pinned in the surf, men crawling across open sand, men trying to drag wounded comrades out of the water while fire comes from multiple directions simultaneously. Unit cohesion, which weeks of training had drilled into every man, dissolves almost instantly into small groups, sometimes pairs, sometimes individuals, improvising responses to immediate local threats. Girk found himself on the beach with his fire team, moving toward the tree line under fire. The bunker on the right flank was the dominant tactical problem for that section of beach. Its machine guns were firing in long, traversing bursts that made movement across the sand nearly impossible. Marines were going down. The assault was stalling, and the longer it stalled, the more the Japanese defenders in the bunker and in the surrounding positions would have time to consolidate, to call for reinforcement, to transform what the planners had designated a lightly defended beach into something considerably more costly. The standard tactical response to a defended bunker, working a flanking force around it while suppressive fire keeps the apertures occupied, requires space, coordination, and enough men to execute both tasks simultaneously. On that section of beach, in that first hour, none of those conditions fully obtained. The surf was still dumping men and equipment unpredictably. The jungle edge was close enough that any movement toward the flanks immediately encountered the kind of dense undergrowth that slowed a man to a crawl and offered perfect concealment for Japanese riflemen. And the fire team that Girk was part had already taken casualties. What happened next was described in the citation for the Medal of Honor that was posthumously awarded to Henry Girk, and it was corroborated by the accounts of Marines who survived the action and who testified to what they had witnessed. The citation is a spare, formal document, as all such citations are, but what it describes, stripped of its official language, is something that belongs to a very specific category of human action: the deliberate choice, made in full awareness of its likely consequences, to place one's own body between a weapon and another person. A grenade landed in the position that Girk was sharing with Private First Class Donald Probst. There was no time to throw it back. There was no cover close enough to reach. Girk pulled Probst away from the grenade and covered it with his own body. The explosion killed Henry Girk instantly. Donald Probst survived. That single act, lasting perhaps 2 seconds from the moment of decision to its conclusion, is the center of this story. But it is not the whole story. Because what happened in the hours before that grenade landed, in the methodical, grinding effort to suppress and ultimately destroy the bunker complex on the right flank of the Cape Torquena beach, is a story that illuminates something important about the nature of the fighting that the 3rd Marine Division undertook that morning, and about the particular quality of the men who undertook it. The assault on the bunker complex was not a single dramatic charge. It was a sustained effort lasting the better part of 4 hours, conducted by a small number of men under continuous fire, against a position that had been designed and built specifically to resist exactly the kind of attack they were mounting. The Marines who carried that fight, Girk among them, used every technique in the Raider training syllabus: fire and movement, grenade work, the careful exploitation of dead ground, the patient identification of apertures, and the equally patient effort to keep fire going through those apertures while another man worked his way to a better position. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese defenders were not passive. The 23rd Infantry Regiment had been on Bougainville long enough to know the terrain intimately. They had registered their machine gun fire across every approach to their position. They had sighted their bunkers to provide mutual support, so that an attack on one position immediately drew fire from adjacent positions. They had stockpiled grenades and ammunition in quantity sufficient for sustained defense. And they had, in the tradition of Japanese defensive doctrine as it had evolved through the campaigns of the Pacific War, no intention of withdrawing. Japanese defensive doctrine in 1943 had undergone a significant evolution from the bonsai charge mentality that had characterized some of the early Pacific fighting. The catastrophic losses suffered in the charges on Guadalcanal, where Japanese infantry had thrown themselves in mass frontal assaults against American machine gun positions with predictably devastating results, had persuaded at least some elements of the Japanese army that a different approach was required. The new doctrine emphasized the construction of mutually supporting defensive positions, the use of natural cover to maximize the effectiveness of small numbers of defenders, and the infliction of maximum casualties on the attacker before any withdrawal or last stand. A garrison ordered to hold a position was expected to hold it until it was physically incapable of doing so, but it was also expected to make the cost of taking that position as high as possible. The men defending the bunker complex at Cape Torquena were following that doctrine with considerable skill. They had the advantage of terrain, preparation, and the psychological weight of being the defenders rather than the attackers. They also had, as the morning progressed and the scope of the American landing became clear, every incentive to fight as long as possible. If the beach could be held, or even if the Americans could be pinned on the beach long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the main Japanese positions to the north and south, the entire lodgment operation might be disrupted. It was not held. The beach was not held, and the reinforcements did not arrive in time to change the outcome of the first day's fighting. By the evening of November 1st, the 3rd Marine Division had a beachhead roughly 8,000 yards wide and perhaps 1,000 yards deep. It was not a large piece of ground, and it had cost 178 Marines killed and wounded in the first day alone. But it was a beachhead, and in the logic of amphibious warfare, a beachhead that exists at the end of the first day is a beachhead that could be expanded, reinforced, and ultimately transformed into the airfields and defensive perimeter that the entire Bougainville operation had been designed to establish. The bunker complex on the right flank had been reduced. The Marines who reduced it had done so at considerable cost to themselves, and the cost included Henry Girk. He was 21 years old. He had grown up in Nichi, a small town in the extreme north of North Dakota, close enough to the Canadian border that on a clear day you could see the prairies stretching away to the north without any visible boundary marking where one country ended and the other began. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1942, at a time when the Pacific War was still very much in doubt, when the outcome at Guadalcanal had not yet been decided, and when the Japanese advance through the central and southwestern Pacific had only recently been halted. He had gone through the Raider training that transformed Marine volunteers into a particular kind of soldiers the Raiders were designed to be, small unit fighters, comfortable in jungle conditions, capable of operating with minimal support and maximum initiative. Nothing in his training and nothing in his previous combat experience in the Solomons had specifically prepared him for the decision he made on the morning of November 1st. That is the nature of that particular decision. It cannot be trained for, not in any direct sense. It emerges from something that lies beneath training, beneath doctrine, beneath the formal structures of military education. It emerges from a relationship between one man and the man beside him. In this case, the relationship between Henry Girk and Donald Probst, two men in a fire team on a beach under fire, connected by the specific, irreducible bond that combat creates between men who are dependent on each other to stay alive. The Medal of Honor citation for Henry Girk was approved in 1944. It reads, in the formal language that such documents employ, that Private First Class Girk demonstrated extraordinary heroism by pushing his fellow Marine aside and taking the full force of the grenade blast himself. The word heroism, in this context, is both accurate and somehow insufficient. What Girk did was not a calculated act. It was not the product of a moment's reflection, a weighing of options, a decision made after considering alternatives. It was an instantaneous physical response. The body moving before the mind had fully processed what was happening, and the fact that it was instantaneous is perhaps the most important thing about it. It tells you something about the kind of man he had become, and about what the Marines who trained him had understood about the deepest purpose of that training. The larger battle for Cape Torquena continued after Henry Girk's death with a momentum that his small, fierce action had helped to establish. The right flank of the beachhead, the section of beach that had been most seriously threatened by the bunker complex, was secured by mid-morning. By afternoon, the first elements of follow-on waves were ashore, and the beachhead was being organized for defense. The Japanese counterattacks that General Hyakutake ordered in the days and weeks following the landing were determined and, on several occasions, came close to breaking through the Marine perimeter. A major Japanese naval force, including 4 heavy cruisers, attempted to disrupt the landing on the night of November 1st and 2nd in what became known as the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, a surface engagement that the American cruiser and destroyer force under Rear Admiral Stanton Merrill won decisively, sinking the Japanese light cruiser Sendai and a destroyer, while suffering only damage to its own ships. On land, the fighting for the Bougainville perimeter continued for weeks. The Japanese launched a major counterattack in March of 1944 that, at its peak, penetrated to within a few hundred yards of the American airfields, the very airfields that the entire operation had been designed to build. The counterattack was defeated with heavy Japanese losses, and the airfields were never seriously threatened again. By the summer of 1944, American aircraft operating from Bougainville had played a significant role in the neutralization of Rabaul, and the strategic logic that had sent 14,000 Marines into the surf at Cape Torquena on November 1st, 1943 had been vindicated. Henry Girk did not live to see any of it. He did not live to see the airfields completed, or the Japanese counterattack defeated, or the slow, grinding campaign that pushed the war's front line progressively closer to the Japanese home islands. He died on the beach in the first hour of the first day, having accomplished exactly what a Marine raider was supposed to accomplish, the suppression and reduction of an enemy's strong point that was preventing the advance, and then, at the very last moment, having done something that no training manual specified and no tactical doctrine required. He had saved the man beside him. Donald Probst survived the Battle of Cape Torquena. He survived the subsequent fighting on Bougainville. He returned to the United States. The record does not preserve, in any detail that has come down to us, what he made of the fact of his survival and the specific means by which it had been purchased. That is a private thing beyond the reach of history. What history does preserve is the bare, essential fact. Henry Girk died so that Donald Probst would not, and the ground that they had fought for together was held. The 3rd Marine Raider Battalion was eventually deactivated in 1944, as the Marine Corps reorganized its forces and the specific tactical rationale for the Raider concept was absorbed into the standard Marine infantry structure. The veterans of the Raiders were distributed to other units and continued fighting through the remaining campaigns of the Pacific War, at Guam, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. They carried with them the training, the habits of mind, and the specific understanding of close jungle fighting that the Raider program had instilled, and they passed those qualities on to the units they joined. Cape Torokina itself was transformed, as planned, into a major American base. By the end of 1943, 3 airstrips were operational. By early 1944, the base was capable of supporting the full range of tactical and strategic air operations that Halsey's planners had envisioned. The Japanese garrison on Bougainville, some 40,000 men under General Hyakutake, was effectively cut off from resupply and reinforcement. A significant portion of that garrison survived the war in a state of progressive deterioration, foraging for food in the jungle, conducting increasingly hopeless attacks against the Allied perimeter, and dying in numbers that dwarfed the American losses at Cape Torokina, not in battle but from starvation and disease. The economics of the Bougainville campaign, viewed in retrospect, were precisely what the Allied planners had intended. The investment of American lives and material on November 1st, 1943, and in the weeks of fighting that followed, had produced a strategic return. The neutralization of Rabaul, the establishment of a major air base, the isolation of tens of thousands of Japanese troops, that far exceeded its cost. This is the kind of calculation that war compels, and it is a calculation that is made more easily in the planning rooms and on the beaches where the cost is actually paid. Henry Girk is buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. The Punch Bowl, as it is commonly known, a volcanic crater that has been consecrated to memory of the American dead of the Pacific War. His Medal of Honor was presented to his family at a ceremony that the record dates to 1944. A destroyer escort, the USS Girk, was named his honor and commissioned in 1945, a small, still acknowledgement from a grateful nation that his name would not disappear entirely into the vast anonymity of the war's dead. The USS Girk served in the post-war Navy until 1973, participating in operations in Korean waters during the Korean War and conducting routine patrols and exercises of the Cold War fleet. When she was decommissioned, her name passed out of active service. There is no Girk in today's Navy. There is a Medal of Honor citation, the grave and the punch bowl, and the account of the men who were there, men who are themselves now gone, the last of them having passed from the living world in the years since the turn of the century. What remains is the story itself and the specific, irreducible fact at its center. On a beach in the Pacific, on the first morning of November 1943, a young man from North Dakota who was seasick and frightened and operating under conditions of extreme violence and confusion looked at the man beside him and made, in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, the most consequential decision of his life. The decision cost him everything. It cost him the remainder of a life that had barely begun. He was 21 years old, with whatever future a 21-year-old carries inside him, whatever he might have become, whatever he might have built or learned or loved in the decades that the war denied him. What it did not cost, and what it protected absolutely, was the life of Donald Probst. There is a quality to that kind of action that resists the usual frameworks of military history, the frameworks of strategy and doctrine and tactical analysis, all of which are real and important and necessary for understanding how wars are won and lost. Those frameworks can explain why Cape Torokina was selected as the landing site, why the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion was assigned to the right flank of the assault, why the bunker complex was where it was and how it had been built, and why it was so difficult to reduce. They can explain the broader campaign and its strategic logic and its ultimate outcome. They cannot explain Henry Girk. What they can do, and what the story of Cape Torokina finally offers, is a frame within which that inexplicable thing can be seen clearly. The frame is built from all the verifiable, documentable elements: the strategy, the tactics, the specific geography of the beach, the specific nature of the Japanese defenses, the specific training and history of the 3rd Marine Raiders. All of it is real, all of it is necessary, and all of it exists in service of the moment when a 21-year-old from Netch, North Dakota, made his choice. Seasick, frightened, exhausted from 4 hours of fighting, not the most threatening figure in the assault force by any outward measure, until he was. The question of what a man carries with him into combat, not the physical weight of his rifle and pack and ammunition, but the interior weight, the accumulated experience and fear and understanding that shapes every decision he makes under fire, is one that military historians have returned to repeatedly across the decades since the Second World War ended. It is a question without a clean answer, because the interior experience of combat is by definition resistant to the kind of documentation that history depends on. Men do not, as a general rule, stop in the middle of a firefight to record their thoughts. What survives is fragmentary. The after-action reports written in the hours and days following an engagement, the letters home that were subject to censorship and to particular self-censorship that men apply when writing to people they are trying not to frighten, the memoirs composed years or decades later when memory has done its selective work and the sharpest edges of the experience have been worn smooth by time. What those fragments reveal, taken together and read carefully, is a portrait of the Pacific infantryman in 1943 that is considerably more complex than the heroic simplifications that wartime propaganda required and that post-war commemoration has tended to preserve. The men who fought at Cape Torquay and on the other beaches and ridges of the Solomons campaign were not fearless. They were not indifferent to the possibility of their own death. They were not animated, in the heat of the fighting, by the large abstract concepts, democracy, freedom, the defeat of fascism, that the war's official narratives invoked. They were animated by something smaller and more immediate. The next few yards of ground, the man on their left and the man on their right, the specific tactical problem directly in front of them and the specific tools they had available to solve it. Private First Class Henry Girk had been carrying a particular interior weight since well before the landing craft hit the beach at Cape Torquay. The crossing from New Caledonia to Bougainville had taken days, and those days have been spent in a particular suspended state that precedes a contested landing, a state that combined enforced idleness with the knowledge of what was coming, producing a psychological condition that the men who experienced it described variously as dread, impatience, numbness, and a strange, almost euphoric clarity about what mattered and what did not. Added to this, in Girk's case, was the physical misery of seasickness, which is a remarkably democratic affliction. It does not respect rank, training, or demonstrated courage, and it reduces its sufferers to a condition of animal wretchedness that has nothing to do with fighting capacity, but feels, in the moment, like a fundamental undermining of the self. The Japanese defenders at Cape Torquay had their own interior weight, and it is worth pausing to consider what it consisted of. The men of the 23rd Infantry Regiment had been on Bougainville for months. They had built their defensive positions with considerable care and skill, working in the heat and the rain and the insects that made construction in the Solomon Islands a miserable enterprise under any circumstances. They had been told that the Americans would come, and they had prepared accordingly, and they had done so in the knowledge that their nearest significant reinforcement was at Bin, to the south, where the main Japanese garrison was concentrated. They were, in the specific tactical sense, an outpost force, numerous enough to impose serious costs on any landing, but not numerous enough to stop one if the Americans came to the strength that the landing at Cape Torquay ultimately represented. The Imperial Japanese Army in 1943 operated under a set of moral and psychological pressures that had no real equivalent in the American force. The concept of Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, the glorious collective death in battle rather than surrender, had been present in Japanese military culture for decades, but had taken on particular force in the Pacific War as the tide turned against Japan and the possibility of defeat became impossible to ignore entirely. For the defenders of the Cape Torquay beach, the practical meaning of Gyokusai was not necessarily a formal death charge of the kind that had proved so costly on Guadalcanal. It was a more diffuse commitment to fighting until the position was physically untenable, inflicting maximum casualties in the process, and not seeking or accepting the alternative of withdrawal or surrender. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of defense that the Marines assaulting the beach encountered. Not a single dramatic last stand, but a sustained, methodical resistance that required sustained, methodical effort to overcome. The medical dimension of the Cape Torquay landing has received less attention than the tactical dimension, but it shaped the morning's events in ways that are worth understanding. The Navy corpsmen who accompanied the Marine assault waves had prepared as carefully as the riflemen for what they would find on the beach, but the combination of surf conditions, Japanese fire, and the sheer volume of casualties produced a situation that exceeded the capacity of any pre-landing preparation to fully address. Men were going down in the water, in the surf zone, on the open sand, in the initial fighting at the tree line. The corpsmen moved from casualty to casualty under fire, performing the triage that the situation required. Identify who could be stabilized and evacuated, who needed immediate intervention to survive long enough to reach the ships offshore, and who was beyond help. The wounded who could be moved were brought back through the surf to the landing craft that were still running between the beach and the transports offshore. This was itself a dangerous operation. The surf was still running heavy. The Japanese were still firing at anything that moved on the beach, and the landing craft that had survived the initial assault were already damaged and operating at reduced capacity. The logistics of casualty evacuation in a contested amphibious landing are among the most complex and demanding in all of military medicine, and the corpsmen and boat crews who performed that work on the morning of November 1st did so with a competence and a courage that the historical record acknowledges, but that the larger narrative of the battle tends to absorb without specific recognition. Henry Girk did not require evacuation. He was killed instantly, and the specific mercy of that fact, if mercy is the right word for any part of what happened on that beach, is that he did not experience the drawn-out suffering that the wounded around him endured. The grenade that killed him performed its function with the blunt efficiency that anti-personnel weapons are designed to achieve, and the man he had pushed aside survived without serious injury. This asymmetry, the totality of one outcome against the completeness of the other, is the kind of fact that the men who witnessed it would carry for the rest of their lives, in a specific, indelible way that witness death lodges itself in memory. Donald Probst went on fighting. That is what the record shows, and it is the most important thing it shows, because it demonstrates that what Girk had done had achieved its purpose completely. The fire team was reduced by one, but it was not broken. The assault on the right flank of the beach continued. The bunker complex was eventually reduced. The beach was secured. In the tactical arithmetic of the morning, the loss of Henry Girk and the survival of Donald Probst balanced out to a net result that the assault could absorb, not because Girk's life was expendable, but because the purpose for which he had given it was achieved. The word sacrifice is used so routinely in connection with military death that it has lost much of its precision. It is applied to men who died in battle, without any element of deliberate choice, men killed by artillery fire or snipers or the random, indiscriminate violence of combat, who had no opportunity to weigh alternatives and who died as a direct result of being in a place where violent force was being applied. That is a real loss and a real service, but it is not, in the strict sense, a sacrifice. A sacrifice requires the element of choice, the deliberate giving up of something of value for a purpose beyond oneself. Henry Girk's death was a sacrifice in exactly that strict sense. He chose, he acted on his choice, and the purpose, Donald Probst's life, was preserved. That precision matters, not as a way of ranking one kind of death above another, but as a way of seeing clearly what happened on the beach at Cape Torokina and what it means. The Pacific War produced thousands of deaths that were sacrifices in this strict sense. Men who threw themselves on grenades, men who charged machine gun positions to draw fire away from their units, men who remained at their posts under circumstances where withdrawal would have been both possible and defensible. Each of those deaths was particular and individual, rooted in a specific relationship and a specific moment, and each of them is diminished rather than honored by the habit of abstracting them into the general category of heroic sacrifice and moving on. Henry Girk deserves better than that abstraction. He was a young man from a small town on the northern prairie who joined the Marines when his country was at war, who trained hard and served well, who was seasick on the morning of the most important day of his life, and who, in the last 2 seconds of that life, did the most important thing a person can do for another person. The beach was held. The war went on. Donald Probst lived. Those facts are his monument, more durable than any stone. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.